Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History, as we look today at the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Because in 1960, Dwight Eisenhower neither wished to nor could run for the presidency again, 2 terms being good enough for George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower, and the 22nd Amendment. So the Republicans nominated Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, to run against a young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, often remembered as JFK. Kennedy's vice presidential candidate would be Lyndon Johnson, often remembered as LBJ, a powerful politician from Texas who had nearly won the Democratic nomination himself and was put on the ticket to keep him happy and to balance the ticket between a Northerner and a Southerner, despite the fact that he and Kennedy profoundly disliked one another. Now, while both candidates were in their 40s. Indeed, it was the first time both major candidates, or I believe either major candidate, had been born in the 20th century, and both were World War II veterans. Both had been congressmen and senators. Of the two, John F. Kennedy seemed to represent youth and change, although many Americans feared him too because he was Catholic. One North Carolina Baptist preacher said, "I fear Catholicism more than I fear communism." And it was feared there'd be a telephone line directly from the White House to the Vatican should Kennedy be elected. Kennedy, on the other hand, accused Eisenhower and Nixon of letting the communists get too far ahead, with the launch of Sputnik looking bad for Eisenhower, the loss of Cuba, the ever-escalating arms race, in which America was falling behind in a missile gap, all made it hard for Nixon to defend his old administration. And Nixon and Kennedy would engage in the first televised presidential debates. In fact, the first debates between major presidential candidates ever. And in the televised debates, Kennedy did look young and fit and handsome, whereas Nixon looked shifty and sweaty, unappealing. Indeed, in the first debate, Nixon refused to wear makeup, despite the fact he was recovering from the flu, and came off looking particularly bad. It is said that most people who heard the debate on the radio felt Nixon had done the better job. He did have a lot of experience, and he could be a great public speaker, but those who saw it on television were swept away by the young and handsome Kennedy. He got many votes in the North and in big cities. He still carried much of the Deep South. They may have distrusted a Catholic, but the Civil War's only been over for 95 years, and many Southerners still do not want to vote for the party of Lincoln. And he kept the rest of the New Deal coalition too. The working class, blacks, and of course Catholics in all parts of the country voted for Kennedy. In Chicago, some of them voted several times, whether they were dead or alive. Kennedy won with 303 electoral votes. Nixon had 219, and Harry Byrd, a senator from Virginia with Strom Thurmond as his running mate, got 15. All the popular vote was much, much closer. John F. Kennedy thus became the youngest man elected to the presidency, although Theodore Roosevelt had been a little younger when he succeeded McKinley. In his inaugural address, Kennedy inspired the nation, declaring that a torch had been passed to a new generation, but warned that we also faced new challenges in the long twilight struggle of the Cold War, and told Americans to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Kennedy wanted to build up the military, both to close the missile gap between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, although a missile gap he had actually rather exaggerated while a senator and presidential candidate, but also to permit a flexible response, to allow the U.S. military to respond in a multitude of ways, and not simply nuking the enemy to radioactive ash or doing nothing at all, as it ended up being the policy's options under Eisenhower. This meant, among other things, expanding the Army and the Navy, especially the Special Forces, and relying less on the threat of mutual assured destruction. And even if Kennedy had exaggerated the missile gap, he had a point. The Soviets had tested their first ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, in 1957. The rocket that had launched Sputnik could have hit the United States in about 30 minutes after its launch. The U.S. would not test a ICBM until 1959. Still, for several years to come, neither country would have enough ICBMs to rely on them entirely, and short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles would remain very important. In 1961, American U-2 spy planes discovered the Soviet Union did not have as many nuclear weapons as had been thought. The missile gap was not so wide as Kennedy had claimed, and so now Kennedy began discussing Khrushchev's old idea of a nuclear test ban treaty, which was signed in 1963 by the United States, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom. France said they would still test nuclear weapons when and where they liked. In response to Sputnik, Eisenhower had created NASA, and Kennedy planned to expand upon it. In November of 1957, poor Laika the space dog had become the first living creature launched into space. The United States would not respond until January 31st, 1961, 11 days after Kennedy's inauguration, by launching Ham, the Space Chimp, into space. And he would be returned safely to Earth and live out many years in retirement under the care of the Air Force. But we didn't have to send up Ham. We could have sent a human, but we're afraid that he might be killed in the attempt, so we didn't, allowing the Soviets to beat us into space yet again. As on April 12, 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, became the first man to orbit the Earth. Now, the U.S. had been training men to go into space since 1959, and the first of them did go into space May 5, 1961, that being Alan Shepard, although he did not go up as far or stay up as long as Yuri Gagarin, who had gone into orbit. Alan Shepard went up barely high enough to count as going into space and came right back down, being off the ground 15 minutes and 28 seconds. He spent much longer on the launch pad waiting to be launched than he spent in flight. But he did prove an American could be launched into space and could pilot a spacecraft. Later that month, May 25th, 1961, John F. Kennedy pledged the United States would put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth by the end of the decade. On February 20th, 1962, the third American into space, John Glenn, did go into orbit, becoming the first American to orbit the Earth, staying up over 4 hours and circling the Earth 3 times. His space capsule landed in the Atlantic Ocean, where it was recovered by a warship, USS Noah, commanded by John Exum from Johnson City. Johnson City just built a brand new high school and named the road passing in front of it John Exum Parkway in his honor. More men went into space over the next few years, and on July 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission fulfilled Kennedy's pledge to land on the moon. And the next day, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the surface of the moon. Not just the first American, but the first human being, saying that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. He was accompanied by Buzz Aldrin, and a total of 6 missions, 12 Americans would walk on the lunar surface, and no Soviet ever went. The last Apollo mission left the moon December 14, 1972. Back on Earth, the world was increasingly seen as divided, not just between the free world, America and our allies, and the Soviet Union and her allies, the communist world, but as more and more of Europe's colonies in Africa and Asia became independent, those countries not part of the free world or the communist world formed a third world, whom both the U.S. and the Soviets would try to influence, in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. To gain support in the Third World, Kennedy offered more American aid and created the Peace Corps to send young Americans on missions of freedom to foreign countries to offer technical assistance, medical aid, and education. Kennedy was particularly concerned about Third World countries falling to communism because, of course, Cuba had already done so, after Fidel Castro led the revolution that overthrew Fulgencio Batista in 1959, despite Batista's support from the United States. Although Castro at first claimed he wasn't communist, he soon proved that he was, nationalizing industries, seizing plantations, and seeking support from the Soviet Union. Many Cubans, particularly middle and upper class Cubans who lost their farms or businesses, fled to the United States, primarily Florida, and demanded the U.S. help them win freedom for Cuba again. And so, with Eisenhower's permission and then Kennedy's, the CIA began to train a group of Cuban exiles. On April 17, 1961, with help from the United States, those Cubans were returned to Cuba to land on the beaches at the Bay of Pigs. They had been promised American air support as well, but at the last minute Kennedy changed his mind, fearing that sending American planes to attack Cuba directly might spark a larger war. Without that air cover, most of the Cuban invaders were killed or captured, either on the beach or not long afterwards. And this frightened Castro, of course, but the Soviet Union too. As the next year, in 1962, Nikita Khrushchev began placing nuclear missiles in Cuba in secret. But it wasn't secret for long, as it was discovered by America's spy planes in October of 1962, who took photographs of these nuclear missiles, intermediate-range ballistic missiles that could hit almost any part of the United States in 15 minutes or less. This was partly to protect Cuba, but also in response to America having placed missiles of similar range in Italy and Turkey, where they could hit the most populous parts of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union prior to this had not been able to respond, and now they could. All this became the Cuban Missile Crisis. As for 13 days, the U.S. and the Soviet Union seemed to be on the brink of war. Kennedy ordered a blockade of Cuba to stop any Soviet ships that might take more missiles or other supplies or even soldiers to that island in our backyard. A blockade, though, can be considered an act of war, so Kennedy officially called it a quarantine. He and Khrushchev each blamed the other for pushing the world to the brink of war. And this came to be known as Brinksmanship, a political strategy of pushing things to the very brink of a crisis in the hopes the other guy would back down first. And in the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved by Khrushchev agreeing to remove his missiles from Cuba. Although, very quietly, the United States agreed to remove our missiles from Turkey as well. That, though, was not widely publicized. Khrushchev's removal of the missiles from Cuba was well known and made him look weak to other communist leaders back home. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union created a hotline, a direct telephone connection between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, so the leaders of the two countries could discuss crises instantly. Because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, messages had been sent in code, which then had to be decoded, a process that could take hours. Waiting 10 or 12 hours for a major message to be decoded simply isn't acceptable in an age when ICBM can fly across the North Pole and strike the other side in 30 minutes or less. And while Khrushchev did get the main thing he wanted, American missiles removed from close range to the Soviet Union, he was seen as weak back home. He was seen by much of the world as having been the one to stand down. Furthermore, he had been leader of the Soviet Union at a time when the Soviet Union and Communist China had begun to drift apart. The two had come to disagree over the best way to implement communism at home, the best way to spread communism abroad, and quite physically over where the precise border between the two countries were, even involving some skirmishing and shots fired along that border. So that by 1961, a Sino-Soviet split had clearly taken place, at least clearly for the Soviets and the Chinese. Much of the rest of the world did not yet realize there was this split in the communist world, so that really it was not just the free world against the communist world, but the Soviet sphere against communist China, which had one or two allies of its own within the communist world, and of course Yugoslavia doing its own communist thing. And as a consequence, in 1964, Nikita Khrushchev was forced into retirement and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who had run the country for nearly 20 years. Cuba was not the only problem. There was trouble in East Germany. In communist East Germany, the government claimed that too many people, including many spies, were coming into East Germany to escape the cruel, cold, capitalist West, and were overwhelming East Germany and also spying on it. In fact, the reverse was true. Many people were fleeing East Germany to escape communism. This was particularly a problem in Berlin, where the western half of the city was occupied by U.S., British, and French troops and part of the country of West Germany. Anyone in East Germany who wanted to leave the country just went to Berlin, went to the airport in the western part of the city, and flew to West Germany. Even other parts of the Soviet sphere. While it was difficult to travel, it wasn't impossible. Other people wanting to flee communism would go to East Berlin, then West Berlin, and into freedom. And so, at midnight, as August 12th turned to August 13th, 1961, the East German government began to close off West Berlin, completely surrounding the city with concrete barriers and barbed wire. A process that expanded over the next few days, indeed over the next few decades. As at first prefabricated concrete barriers were put in place, and eventually all of West Berlin was surrounded by a 12-foot wall with barbed wires, machine gun towers, by the late 1970s, automatic machine guns on swivels and with motion detectors that if someone got too close would automatically turn and shoot at them. There were landmines. There were other security around the wall. The top of the wall even had a pipe built into it, so that if you were somehow able to get to the wall, somehow able to run and jump and grab the top of this 12-foot structure, that curved pipe would make it hard to grip, and you'd slide back down. Border guards were told to shoot on sight, and at least 200 people were killed over the years trying to escape, although many did successfully escape, especially in the early days, before the wall was nearly as fortified as it later became. There was even a case of someone simply crashing a car through the wall. On the western side of the wall, where there was no security, West Berliners covered it with graffiti. The West feared, though, that East Germany and the Soviet Union might soon try to completely take over Berlin, and sent more troops to defend it. And in 1963, President Kennedy visited Berlin himself, and gave a speech in front of the Berlin Wall, saying that the Berlin Wall stood for all the peoples divided by the Iron Curtain, saying, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was civis Romanus sum, Latin for I am a Roman citizen. Today, in a world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. And a legend has grown up around this that, like many legends, is both true and not true. Ich bin ein Berliner is meant to mean I am Berlinese, I am from Berlin. But German makes a distinction that you can find in English but typically don't. We might say, for example, I am American or I am an American and mean basically the same thing. In German, however, to say you are a something makes you an object, or at least a non-human thing. In English, we might find this. There is, for example, in northeastern Germany, a region called Pomerania. But to say I am Pomeranian or I am a Pomeranian are clearly different things, even for Americans. So the problem for Kennedy is that while a Berliner can be a person from Berlin, it can be a thing from Berlin too, where specifically it refers to a local pastry, a jelly-filled donut. So it's come to be said that Kennedy went to Berlin and said, "The proudest boast is I am a jelly donut." In fact, this is not what he meant, and the people of Berlin knew what he meant and knew that he stood with them. And for the next 28 years, the Berlin Wall would stand as a very physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain. And furthermore, fences and guard posts and landmines would run the entire length of the inner German border between East and West Germany and along Czechoslovakia's borders with West Germany and Austria. Kennedy also worried about South Vietnam and increased American support for that country, sending more money, more supplies, and now military advisors to train the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. By the end of Kennedy's presidency, there were about 3,000 American military personnel in Vietnam. At home, Kennedy promised a new frontier that would improve the economy, health care, education, and civil rights. And in this, he was supported by a cabinet mostly made up of young, brilliant men, mostly educated in the Ivy League, a group who would look down on the poorly educated Lyndon Johnson and whom he would resent as a bunch of snobs. Kennedy picked for his attorney general his little brother, Robert F. Kennedy, also known as Bobby Kennedy, or just RFK for short, saying it would be good practice for him to have been attorney general when he opened a law practice of his own. After this, laws were passed to prevent presidents from naming their relatives to the cabinet. And Bobby Kennedy would be very influential in pushing some of Kennedy's legislation through Congress and enforcing some controversial laws as well. Robert McNamara left the presidency of Ford Motor Company to become Secretary of Defense, and would later become very unpopular among opponents of the Vietnam War for leading the military, or at least the Defense Department, through it. Later it would turn out he had doubts about the war, and in some cases undermined the president's policies, so people supportive of the war have come to look down upon him as well. As part of the new frontier, Social Security benefits were increased in 1961, being extended to jobs that had not previously gotten them, increasing benefits and allowing people to take Social Security at 62 rather than 65, although they would get a lower monthly payment to make up for it. Also in 1961, Kennedy made adjustments to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which raised the minimum wage to $1.25 an hour. And over the next few years, the minimum wage would continue to rise. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act required equal pay for equal work, primarily to get companies to pay women the same wages they paid men of similar experience in similar jobs. Although it would also apply to African Americans and other groups discriminated against in the workplace too. And although there were loopholes in the act, and even today, women do not on average make as much as men, it was a very big step in getting women equality in the workplace. And statistics today showing inequality in pay, while real, are sometimes distorted by the fact that men do often work in higher paid fields in general. Although other inequalities certainly exist too. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, describing the effects of chemical fertilizers and pesticides on wildlife, particularly insects, which were often killed by pesticides not meant to target them, and birds. DDT in particular, although effective at killing mosquitoes, could cause birds to lay eggs with shells so fragile mother birds would crush their own eggs while sitting on the nest. And she envisioned a time when there would be a silent spring, with no insects left to buzz or birds to sing. And the publication of this book is often seen as the beginning of the modern environmentalist movement, which would seek not just to conserve the wilderness areas that existed, but to clean up the pollution that mankind had created. And the next year, in 1963, the Clean Air Act began to regulate air pollution, which was terrible in many big cities. And over the decade, more and more environmental laws would be passed. Now, when it came to civil rights, Kennedy moved cautiously at first, despite having promised to Martin Luther King Jr. and others to support civil rights. But he did not want to anger Southern Democrats. Over time, though, he began to offer increasing support for black students who wanted to attend traditionally white schools and for voter registration movements. In particular, he came to support civil rights much more strongly after seeing violence against black protesters in Birmingham and elsewhere in the South on national television. And he would eventually support a major civil rights bill that would be passed the year after his death, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Kennedy might have done much more as president, as he hoped to pass middle-class and corporate tax cuts, and was becoming more supportive of civil rights and questioning America's involvement in Vietnam. For the generation that saw Kennedy become president and who invested so much hope in this young and promising leader, there's always some speculation what he might have done, how much better things might have been, had things not gone as they did on his visit to Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. There, while riding in an open car through the city, Kennedy was assassinated. An assassination blamed on Lee Harvey Oswald, who was arrested shortly afterwards. Oswald was never fully questioned about this, though, because he himself was assassinated just a couple days later, while police were transporting him from one holding cell to a building across town. There have always been many conspiracy theories about Kennedy's murder, and quite a few details, especially the paths that the bullets that hit him and another man in the same car must have taken, have always raised a lot of questions. But there was an investigation shortly afterwards by a commission led by Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, and the Warren Commission officially determined that Oswald had acted alone.